Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world with information that businesses need to know now. Today, I have a special guest on the show. We're actually giggling and laughing before we started recording. I know her well, and it's a thrill to have her on the show. This is Karyn Bright. She is a communications consultant at Understanding Identity. I want to say that again. On the show, we have Karyn Bright, communications consultant at Understanding Identity. Hello, Karyn.
Hi, everybody.
Well, you don't know how excited I am to have you on the show. You and I have been collaborating together for a while now on other identity related things. And, I love identity people who work in this space because I feel like you are so close to a lot of the privacy issues that people have. So, I had the pleasure of starting to get into identity actually in 2019. I was asked to speak at an identity conference in Amsterdam, and I met so many wonderful people in that space. That people were very welcoming to me as an outsider, not a person in identity. And over the years, I've grown a lot of friends and clients in that area. But your first of all, you're fascinating. Your background, I can't wait for you to tell the audience about that, and just sort of talk to me about kind of identity in general and sort of your trajectory of where you are now and understanding identity.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Debbie. And it's great to be chatting with you and it's kind of the broader issues around identity, because I don't really come from the typical background that many identity people do of product or regulatory or policy. I'm a marketing and comms professional, and I've always worked in the field of data. So one of my kind of first jobs was with a big data analytics company that did clinical trial data. And for my sins, I think I'm a bit of a data nerd, really, in that I love what data tells you. I don't ask me anything about the technology or about the techniques or the statistical sort of analyses that have to be done, but I do love what comes out of data. And I can always remember with a company that I was first working with back in the UK, when we went to do a demonstration of our software to one of the big supermarkets that were just launching loyalty cards. So this is taking you back quite a way now. You'll probably work out that we're at least into the 90s. And actually looking at what was a whole lot of data points visualized on a screen and being able to drill into that and say, actually, this particular customer buys product X and product Y, and they typically shop at this time, and they are interested in these other sort of products which they buy from time to time. For me, that was like the light bulb moment. I just couldn't believe that what had been just a load of numbers and sort of bits and bytes and kind of really only understood by a lot of very techie people suddenly came to life in front of the customer when we could actually name an individual customer and actually look at what that story told. So I kind of moved through the data world from what was in the 1990s really the heyday of CRM, customers bought and what other products they might be interested in. It was kind of the forerunner of the Amazon style. Customers who bought this might also like this. And we did a lot of work around understanding customer behavior, customer likes and preferences. And the stories that come out of the data at that level were just fascinating when you could uncover certain types of product groups that would maybe sit well with others. But what we saw then in 2001, so really kind of, I suppose, post 9/11, was with the increase in regulations and increased in sort of internet coming on board as well, there was suddenly, it wasn't just an issue of understanding the kind of products the customers want. There was starting to become an issue, was this customer even who they said they were? So I then moved to work in 2002 for a company that was one of the first companies to launch electronic ID verification. So they had previously done CRM solutions. Now they were interested in, well, we know what that customer likes to buy, but is that customer even who they say and who they claim to be? So the whole way of actually using data as a method of confirming that this really is Debbie Reynolds and she is the person that we should be talking to. That opened up a whole new gamut of applications and conversations. But in a way, that was the start of the problem I think we have today, because what that meant was it became a regulatory issue, it became a product focused issue, and it became a tech issue about how you could get the data through and confirm certain types of attributes, certain pieces of information. It was less about who the customer really was and more about does it match or does it not match? Can we find them on certain data sets, credit bureau data and so on, telephone data? And if we can't, then we effectively reject them. And I think because it was led so much by the tech companies, when we got to 2007 with the launch of smartphone technology, where the customer started to take a lot more control, because suddenly they could create their own content, they could create their own persona, they could have a lot more power and control over how they wanted to present themselves. That's when I think we got into a bit of a muddle with identity, because actually identity stayed very much a technical issue. It became all about, talking about attributes, second factor authentication, PKI keys, tokens, authentication versus identification versus verification. It became a whole language that actually nobody in the consumer world understood. So what I have been really doing in the last 10 years is trying to help organizations redress that balance a little bit and start bringing the whole topic of identity into a much more human conversation, much more understanding of the way the consumer or the user out there thinks about their identity. And they certainly don't think about their identity in terms of second factor authentication or certain attributes or certain keys. For them, it's a much more philosophical, almost emotional connection. And I think the problem we've got at the moment is that the people who have to be identified see identity as one thing, and the companies that provide the technologies to identify them see it as something quite different. And it's that bridging that I'm particularly interested in working in, and we've worked together through Women in Identity on making that story a much more human one, and a much more a story that's much easier to understand by the whole populations that are affected by identity solution and the decisions that get made.
That's fascinating. Now this is fun. So we've worked together, and I didn't even know that backstory. That's fascinating. I think you're right. I think identity is about the human, and I feel like the human is now going to be the center of everything. So
absolutely,
for a lot of these solutions were all about the business. So we have this business, we want to collect this data, and then the person was just kind of a part of that story, where now it's like the person is the story, and then
absolutely
you have to center everything around the human. And I said that, so I did a speech at Consumer Identity World. I guess I give a shout out to Cupping Your Cold, because they hosted that event. And I said then, I'm like, identity to me is like the center of like everything that's going to happen in the future, because companies have to move from, just thinking about data in terms of their own business interests, and think about, a person to me is going to be a bank of their own data, and they're going to have to pick and choose what they show or what they share. But then also right now, what we have so much fragmentation about the type of data that businesses have about people. So they're may be making judgments about people on something that isn't like a fulsome view of that person, but then that person should be able to choose what they share. So let's say
absolutely. I'd almost go so far as to say we need to stop using that language, because the consumer, the human out there, if you ask somebody what they think of as their identity, I've had people in the street give me fantastic sort of definitions. It's my beliefs, it's my values, it's who I am at the core. It's basically, it's not just even my gender or my name and my address and my family background. It's much more fundamental than that. And I feel that by using the word identity within the technology space, when we really mean a credential, an ID, or some sort of proof or token, we've kind of confused the conversation. So almost the identity belongs to the humans that are out there, that, who will always own their identity. But the ID piece, and it is a subtle difference, is the credential, the token that an organization needs to see to be confident that they can trade or they can do business with the individual presenting it. And I've done some work with a big organization here in the UK recently, where that was very much, what we were focusing on was looking at the language around identity. So, for example, not talking about verification, because a customer doesn't, or a human doesn't want to be verified. They want to buy something or get a new bank account or get a SIM card. They want to do something that requires a verification as part of the process, but they're not interested in the word verification. What they're interested in is being recognized. So we started to use much more of the language around recognition. So this solution, this service will recognize your customer. You want to be recognized when you walk into a particular, bank or log on to your online account. You don't want to be verified. So it's very subtle, but it is really important. I think if we're going to get the level of engagement that we need right across the world in all populations and in all sectors, I think we do have to think about the language that we use in this area of technology, because other areas of technology you can get away with it because it doesn't touch the human so directly. But actually, we're talking about individual consumers who, this is fundamental human rights stuff sometimes. So whether they have the right to vote, whether they can, get an education, whether now they can get a vaccine even, that there's going to be some really big issues that will come out of COVID. I think we have to be sure that that whole message around identity is well understood by everybody.
Mm. So that's great. I love that. Tell me what's going on in the world now, or that you see in the future that concerns you most in the identity area.
I think for me, it is the lack of consumer engagement. And I'm using consumer, even that in itself is a very sort of business oriented world. But, when we look at populations where the needs are very different from one area to another, and there is, we got very focused on ID verification as something that was to support financial services, basically, because it was stipulated in regulation that you have to do a KYC check or anti-money laundering checks on customers when they're transferring money, and that is not the only need that some populations have. And I think the danger we'll have in trying to create a level playing field, if you look at the United Nations, Sustainability Charter, they have stipulated that everyone should have a legal identity. Every child should be born and given a legal identity by 2030. That's fine factually, but how do we do that with responsibility to the cultures, the values, and the different society rules that we will need to work within? Because it's very easy, if there's been a very good system that you just need to digitize, that's fine, which, for many perhaps Western economies that can happen. But when you go to areas where certain tribes or certain peoples and minority groups have not been well identified in the past, just even through sort of traditional analog systems, you can't digitize that. And that's one of the big issues. I was talking with Dr. Eve Hayes de Calaf recently for Women and Identity about the law of unintended consequences, when you try to impose a well-meaning, very, but even well thought through technological solution without understanding the full scale of the problems and the needs that the consumers have behind it. So I think there is a danger that the gap between those that can be verified or identified and therefore get access to products and services, including medicine, and the gap between that and people who still sit on the margins and aren't able to actually be part of the new digital revolution, for want of a better description, I think that's going to widen unless we can really sit down and start to think about the real human issues that sit behind.
I agree with that. I think it's time for us to talk about women and identity now, and this is how we got to know each other.
Yeah.
So talk to me about kind of your role at Women in Identity, and then I can kind of chime in.
Sure. Yeah. Well, as you well know, and probably many of the listeners on this podcast will know as well, Women in Identity was set up initially to be a networking group to support what was a minority, i.e. women in the technology industry, where you typically you'd go to an event and there'd be very few women. So, we kind of wanted to create a networking space, just be somewhere where people could go and connect with other women and perhaps feel less alone in some of those big environments. So it was set up by Emma Lindley, Pam Dingle, and Colette D'Alessandro just over 4 years ago, I think now. And I suppose about 2 years ago, I got involved. I'd worked with some of the team before, and it was very clear that the story was evolving very much away from being just about another networking group for women, or and more that actually to become the voice for the underrepresented in the user and the consumer groups that technology and the identity solutions that were being produced were trying to reach. So the brand story that I've been involved with and have helped to work on is very much less about networking and more about being a campaigning voice to make sure that the identity solutions that get produced in the sector work for everybody, and they will work for anyone in regardless of what environment or whatever need. And of course, to do that, you need a more diverse workspace and working teams on the products that are coming out, because for the majority of products, you look at any team and at best there will be a culturally a very similar homogenous team working on it. More often than not, it will be white and male that are developing the solutions. But I had a situation a couple of years ago where I went in to talk to a CEO in California, and he was introducing me to all his team, and it looked on the face of it to be a very diverse team, lots of different cultural backgrounds, lots of different people of different ages, and male and female. But when I commented on that, he said, don't kid yourself, because basically everybody here has been to an Ivy League educational establishments. They've got a very similar educational background. There's similar affluence. They are not diverse, really, and that's one of the things he was looking to address. So it's very easy to get waylaid just by looking on the surface and seeing, a mix of men and women, or different age groups, or all the rest of it. But that whole thinking about representing the users and the sort of problems that users may have is something that Women in Identity now is campaigning really hard on. And I think, it's testimony to all the great work they've been doing, how many sponsors they've got behind them, and organizations that I think are genuinely wanting to make a difference and to change the way we do things.
Absolutely. And I love working with the organization. I'm the data privacy officer for the organization globally. And so I've seen the growth that's happening. You guys support people. Obviously, you have sponsors, but then also you have job boards where people are really looking for that diversity of talent. And so you all have great content. I highly recommend that people go to the website, womeninidentity.org. When I and sign up. So it's free to join. Anyone can join. You don't have to be a woman to join. We have a lot of advocates and supporters all over the world of, all different, different backgrounds. And I think that's what it really takes to drive these types of initiatives.
To have the right conversations, and you very kindly took part in a webinar for us last year, looking at biometrics and issues that may affect privacy that will come out of the latest technologies and latest features and facilities that are coming out of the identity product teams. And I think one of the things we've done really well in Women in Identity is to have those conversations with very different voices that might be traditionally found on a normal conference platform in the days when you'd go along to a big industry event and it would be the same male dominated panels, the same speakers pretty much across the board, talking very technologically and very technically about what was going on in the market. And I felt that what Women in Identity has done, as you've seen and you've been part of, is to bring different voices into that and start talking about different issues not just how the technology might work within a regulatory framework of XYZ.
Right. And I actually, when I gone to Amsterdam, Emma was the first person I met. I just happened to decide to go to her session, and I didn't know anybody in Amsterdam. They invited me there, and we hit it off really well
Yeah,
when we first met. And she was formerly at Visa, and she decided to
right.
start this this organization. Her presentation blew me away, really, because this was in 2019, and she was one of the first people I ever heard talk at a conference about bias.
Exactly. And why not? Why haven't we been talking about that for years?
Right. And just the way that bias can impact identity systems, because you are building systems that handle data of humans. And if humans of all different walks of life can't engage with your product, that is a problem, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just about the data. We've got challenges for people who are very data poor, who don't have huge data histories or credit histories. But there's also the whole process in which you want to identify people, and you're putting them through a process that either culturally or just practically doesn't work for them. Making I used to say this when I was working with teams in London about products they would be designing there that would have perhaps what we call an exception process that would allow them to fall back into a manual process by going into a local office or a local bank branch or something. That doesn't work in rural parts of the country. You just looked at that product purely from the perspective of the 10 million people who live in London, but not for the other 40 or 50 million who may be affected but not have the same ability and the same opportunity to be able to engage with the product simply because of the way you've engineered the process around it. So I think there's the data is really fundamental to identity, but there's also the way in which we look to identify people. And sometimes we don't always think about people who don't live in the same way as we do.
Right. I would love for you to tell this story. So Women in Identity produced a video, and it's staggering to really see it. And I try to tell people to look at it as much as possible, which is you all told a story about a man in Africa who
That's
is
a transgender woman. Yeah,
transgender.
va bene. Yeah.
Right. Just the story of him having trouble banking was staggering. I just couldn't believe it.
Absolutely.
Tell me a little bit
she's
about this story.
Absolutely. She identifies as she, so we're very respectful of calling her she. But and she's only one of many stories. We've actually got quite a few more videos coming out over the coming months, because we've been doing a project to understand what has been the impact of identity exclusion for certain types of people, be it a transgender, be it somebody who lives in a particularly rural part of the country and doesn't have access maybe to the support that you would get in a large city. Looking at people with thin credit backgrounds, so the data is not there to identify them easily. And all of these stories have come together. We've done research in Ghana, we've done research in the UK, so looking at two very different markets to see, what are the common difficulties and the common challenges that underrepresented people can have when they're trying to identify themselves in order to get access to other financial products or government services, whatever it may be. So it's actually part of a wider project. It's the human impact of identity exclusion, and actually what we're really hoping will be the final output. These are just stories along the way to illustrate the extent of the problem. The output that we want to achieve is a code of conduct for the industry, by which we'll have the identity providers, the identity solution and systems manufacturers actually sign up to agree to build their products going forward in a much more robust, diverse and inclusive manner. So thinking about those people like Vabene and some of the others that we've interviewed, thinking about what would it be like for people who are not like me, and the only way you can answer that question is by having those people either in your team or certainly alongside your team. So we're hoping to bring that all together. It's being led by Louise Maynard-Atom, who's one of the great women in identity, working alongside Emma and some of the others. And they're basically at the moment, I think they're still looking for other partners to work with in this next second phase of it. But yeah, the ultimate output will be a code of conduct to which organizations will sign up, and a set of guiding principles, which will actually be a practical framework to help organizations overcome some of these issues, and just prod teams to think about the underrepresented, think about the people you don't normally think about. So it's all very well to do these projects and highlight the problems. I think that's been done many times. What we haven't got as an industry is, well, what do I do about it? How do I actually cope with this challenge? How do I overcome it? So that's what we're seeking to do as Women in Identity, and look out and follow us for more details over the coming months. But ultimately it will be a code of conduct and a framework that organizations can actually use to make the situation better.
Yeah. So that example with the transgender woman, it was centered around banking, her having problems, having the proper ID, having the proper credentials, so to speak. But because, it identifies as a woman and maybe not look like their photo when they were born or something like that.
Yeah, I think she had 5 different identities that she had. Well, I say IDs, I would say in my language. She had 5 forms of ID that she had to carry around with her all the time, because depending on what the organization was matching against, it might have been pre her transition. It might have, so she may have looked more like a man. It would have been, just photographically didn't look the same. She had a different name on some of the IDs, and she had to carry all of these so that no matter which eventuality, she was kind of covered, and she could get through. But yeah, an absolute nightmare. Even just trying to send small amounts of money through the web just was an absolute nightmare. And aside from the frustration and the challenge of just like any of us would have when the system doesn't quite work, there's the emotional stress that for somebody who's already going or has gone through a very difficult time and has made some very big decisions about their personal identity, to have that constantly challenged, to have that constantly brought up and questioned, is really difficult. And again, that's where I often say, identity is not about technology, it's a social science. And we have to look at what we do in identity as it being a science and a social science, and almost linked to philosophy, not linked to, well, the system says you're called Joe Bloggs. That's a very British name, but yeah, it just, Mr. Smith. Therefore, if your card doesn't say Mr. Smith, then you're not Mr. Smith, regardless of who you see yourself as and how you choose to identify yourself. And I think that is one of the big challenges for the industry.
Let's talk about the digital divide. So the digital divide is a huge problem. So we know, and you spoke about earlier, not everyone is in a traditional identity system. It is, the world is very digitized now. Everything now, people want to have it digitized. So for me, I'm concerned about people, for example, if you don't have a smartphone, there are certain things you can't participate in digital life, right? And not everyone has a smartphone. I think the statistic I saw recently, the most recent one, is that 45% of people in the world have smartphones. And obviously some economies have more people, some have less. But it's I think a lot of times when people are creating some of these things, they assume, okay, everyone has a smartphone, and no, not even the majority of people have smartphones.
Absolutely.
So how do we, I feel like Women Identity, you guys are doing tremendous work, and it's an important service that you're doing, because you're highlighting maybe people who don't have access and need
They're not
access.
in that group.
But tell me a little bit about kind of this challenge of the digital divide.
Well, I think firstly, you bang on to actually highlight that it exists. I think there's, again, that sort of bias that those that work in the Western economies and sort of in the Northern Hemisphere, it's like, that's no problem. Everybody's got one or has access to one, you know, and it is so far from the truth. In fact, even more shocking, I think, was we did some research in the UK, and, you know, around about 24% of people didn't have a driving license and a passport. So they have the classic IDs that would be used as part of a verification process weren't available to big, nearly a quarter of the population. And it hadn't been factored in to anybody, you know, who was designing a system. So I think that divide is only going to get bigger unless we change the way we work as an industry, because the technology gets smarter. That, you know, I was doing something today, I didn't even have to put a password in, it just kind of looked at me and let me through the gates of my smartphone. And you know, that's getting, we're all about quickness and efficiency and letting, you know, getting on with the job as quickly as possible. But actually, culturally, there's a lot of people who don't want to operate. That isn't their value system. It's not about getting things done quickly and efficiently, but have they got access to the core systems and core services and products that they're entitled to, that, you know, to even just start to level things up a little bit. I do fear that divide is getting wider and wider. And I think it was something that COVID really threw up, and we're seeing the kind of the repercussions of it now with the vaccination program. You know, the gap between those that are vaccinated, it's nearly a metaphor for the whole identity thing, isn't it? You know, the gap between those that are vaccinated and having boosters already and those that have never even had a first vaccine is huge. And I think, you know, unless we start to think differently about how we do identity, I fear that divide will get wider. One of the things, you know, I've been talking about recently is that we cannot afford as a sector to be competitive anymore. You know, this should not be about being competitive. We have to be collaborative, because there is no silver bullet that will address the problems that meet the needs of a relatively affluent person in a Western economy and somebody who's sitting on the margins in perhaps you know, a culturally non-digitized identity system. And we've seen some of the, you know, the issues that have happened in Kenya, Dominican Republic, even the Aadhaar scheme in India, where, you know, trying to do a one size fits all just did not work. And I think for me, the answer would be actually forgetting about, you know, trying to compete with one another in different ways and get ahead on the latest piece of technology and the latest snazzy facial recognition versus, you know, some sort of analog process, and just look at identity as a social science, and how do we support that for everybody with different mixes of solutions depending on the culture, the values, and the development of the local population.
Yeah, I think another challenge, I think, in identity is that maybe it's not an identity, maybe it's just the way technology is made. So when let's say you have a company that creates a product for just general commercial use, so all they're really thinking about is who their customer is. But when let's say you take that same technology and then you try to use it for like a government use. So let's say you're a phone maker, let's say Apple. So let's say Apple makes cell phones and computers or whatever. So their customers are people who can afford to buy their products and use their services. But let's say if Apple developed an app or developed something where they were creating a system for like the state of New York, right? So not everyone in the state of New York uses Apple products, right? But then you would have this huge gap because you have to find a way to create this service for everybody. So you mentioned the Aadhaar system in India, and so that just that just sort of triggered this thought with me about covering people who aren't your traditional customer. So I think trying to transfer something that's kind of in a traditional consumer market into something that's maybe that your customer is everybody, you know. So how do you handle this challenge if everybody is your customer?
Absolutely. And I've had product teams say, well, you know, we're only interested in our product and actually making sure that works for the customers we've identified, the 80% of the customers that will be able to use it. but it kind of goes back, and this is my own personal view, but it does come back to that point that this is a very human issue, and there is a moral, I think, moral responsibility, whether that's with the government agencies that are implementing it or the banks that are implementing it, to not stop at the core market segments that they have identified they can make the most profit from. It has to be, how do we cover everybody? And it will be a smorgasbord of having different solutions that can work together. Some will work together for this product, for this population. For these that don't have smartphones, or for these who can't have access to particular kind of digital services, then we offer a different route that is made up of different ways that fit for them. But ultimately, the goal is to be able to verify everybody. I mean, we all agree that's what needs to be done. It's just that at the moment, what we've got very carried away with the technology. So the technology has tended to lead and say, well, we can do it for 80%, so we'll not worry about the other 20%. And they've done a great selling job and selling into the big organizations. I can remember back in the very earliest days of electronic ID, all we were worried about was match rates. You know, how many people could we match? Was it 80%? Was it 90%? And it was a numbers game, you know. Because actually now I hope we would be looking at, okay, so what are we doing about the 15 or the 10 or 15% of people that we can't match? What's the solution to get them through? They don't have smartphones, or they don't live within easy access of a supporting office or agency, or they don't have an analog identity that we can just easily convert to digital. So I think and I hope some of the work that Women in Identity is doing will actually transition that conversation away from just thinking about how many people can I see and that's good enough and we'll forget about the rest, to, okay, so who's picking up the rest? You know, and they're not being seen as the kind of the throwaways nobody really wants to have, you know, because you can't make money out of them. and I think it's there is a responsibility. I do think it's a moral responsibility to be saying, right, so what are we doing about those people? How do they need to be served? What are they comfortable with? Do they speak our language, or do we need to be thinking about this in a different way? You know, I've talked to groups in the north of England where many of the women, a migrant population, so first generation, they don't speak English, and the women will typically defer to sons or nephews or husbands to do anything with regards to their identity. So, which was okay for a while, but now when you start to think about things like vaccines and making sure that they're signed up for all the benefits and entitlements that they should have, it can become a little bit more difficult. But nobody's kind of thinking about, well, all right, well, how do we deal with them, and what system do we need to set up to support them in a way that they feel comfortable with, when there's a lot of skepticism and fear and concerns about, you know, Big Brother, privacy issues, and just understanding what the data is being used for.
Right. Let's talk about the tie between identity and privacy. So definitely linked there. You know, I feel like some just developer groups in general, because they're so focused on their products, a lot of times they're like, well, let's do this cool product. We think it's so awesome, and then think about privacy later. And we know that just doesn't work.
No. So then it just you shoot yourself in the foot, because basically the consumer knows that there are issues and that their data is being misused, and then that just kind of undermines everything everyone's trying to do.
Absolutely. So I think, you know, and I work with developer groups a lot, and I work with them on kind of how they're trying to implement certain systems, that you have to think about privacy as a fundamental building block in your tool, because if you don't, it's going to create barriers to adoption of your product.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's the classic thing, rather than, you know, just taking a load of data and building it into the product and then saying, okay, how can I verify this data? It's really thinking about, what is the user trying to do? What do you need to ask them for? And the classic one that we quote is, if you want to know if this person is entitled to buy alcohol, you don't need their date of birth. You know, you don't need to ask them for their date of birth. You just need to know somebody is vouching for the fact that they're over 18. So there's a different way that we need to think about, how do we confirm this person is over 18, other than simply saying, please give me your date of birth. So it's thinking creatively. And I think traditionally, because we've tended to just go, well, that's the way we used to do it. Let's see your driving license, let's see your passport, and if you haven't got either of those, we'll do something slightly different. Is to actually unpick the whole thing and say, well, actually, I don't need to see this person's name. I don't need to see their address. I don't need to see their date of birth. I just need to see some way that can verify this person in front of me is the person presenting the ID, and I need it to be verified that they're over 18 by either some higher body or some other trusted partner. But I think it's thinking that way, because the privacy then becomes something that's inherent in the way you've built the system. I'm thinking about how that user thinks about identity and what they may or may not be comfortable with sharing, rather than just saying, sorry, my system needs to know all of this data.
Right. So that
Computer says no.
Yeah, well, that leads me to the topic of friction. So friction and how people traverse all these systems. So I think and I don't agree with this. So I think the classical way of thinking is, okay, now that we have all these privacy regulations and stuff, let's create more barriers for people to access things, where I think it needs to be the opposite. So I think it needs to be,
absolutely.
You can create systems that can achieve these goals and also reduce the amount of friction that it takes for people to access systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's back to, if you do genuinely think user or customer first, you'll very quickly work out what you need and what you don't need. And I'm really, hopeful that the women in identity work that's going on, we'll start to highlight some of that, the things that you don't actually need to ask for if you're doing a particular type of application development. Why ask for all of that data if it's something that the user would be uncomfortable with? Work out what's the minimum you need to get through whatever process. And if it's regulatory, then obviously there's certain parameters that you've got to work within. But I think it's thinking differently and actually working right back to, well, what does the user need for me to sell safely, or to offer this benefit or this product safely to the person who's asking for it and give them access? What actually do I need to know? And it's going, as I say, go back to that example from before. I don't need to know their date of birth. I need to know they're over 18 or over 21 in the US. So I think it's and that's where having the diverse teams comes in, because somebody will come left of field. If you've got people in that team who think differently, different age groups, somebody will ask the question, well, why do we have to ask for the date of birth? And I think, that's another great argument for having broader thinking and more diverse teams that just step outside sometimes and come at problems slightly differently.
Yeah. What is your biggest concern with privacy right now in the world?
I think it's I think my biggest personal concern is that it just isn't working, and it's been undermined. Because actually, I used to talk about this quite a lot. Privacy in the old world, the physical world, was I can lock all my belongings up and keep them safe around me, and I can release and share or open my door to whoever and whenever I choose. And I was very much in control. Online, I think, we haven't worked out how to do that. We give all the user all the control as they had in the old world. Then you've got issues around identity theft, identity fraud, and we know all of the stuff that goes on around that. I think the way we need to look at it in the new world of digital services and digitization is thinking about, how are you going to use my data? So I may not be able to have control the way I have been used to in the past, but if I can be assured that you are going to use the right, my data is going to be accurate, and you're going to use only the most up-to-date, and I can see what data you hold on me. If it's transparent how you're using my data and where you need to use certain bits of pieces of information, And more to the point, you're going to use it in a way that's relevant to me. So that sort of triangle of accuracy, transparency, and relevancy. If I can see all of those are being respected, I think I can cede control. And that's the new world of privacy. Privacy as it used to be isn't what privacy online is. And I think we've got to sort of think differently about how we define it. For me, I think it is if I know you've got accurate information about me, if I can see how you're using it, and more to the point, it's going to be relevant and to my benefit in the way that you're using it, then I cede much more willingly than simply, handing over data, which is what happens at the moment. I fill out countless forms online and elsewhere. I don't really know where the data is going. Lo and behold, I bought something for Christmas present for somebody the other day, and suddenly I've had an email every day from that organization promoting other things, and I know I didn't tick a box that said, please do now promote the hell out of everything else you sell. So and that's just that, again, that just undermines that whole thing. I want to shop with you, but I did not give you permission to keep sending me information, or at least if I did, it wasn't very transparent where I was supposed to tick. So I think, yeah, to answer your question, it's a long way around, was my biggest concern was privacy, that the whole thing's not working.
Yeah. So on that, what would be your wish? So if it were the world according to Karyn, and we did everything you said, what would be your wish for privacy anywhere in the world, whether it be technology, human, law, anything?
I think it would be that people would understand why it's important, and that comes back to the whole piece that I do, is understanding identity. It's telling the story better. It's consumers, being concerned about their privacy, the way we would have been in the 1950s about, people looking into our gardens or and maybe that's a very Western thing. I don't know. And that would be interesting to explore, I think, as well. Is that the same issue when you live in large communities where people, have a certain degree of communal living and interactivity, but I still maintain that people still always like to have their own material world and their own kind of piece of the world, and we have to respect that. Perhaps privacy for certain populations may be viewed in a slightly different way. So I think we need to understand what privacy really means nowadays, and we need to be looking at it from all aspects and all different populations, because I think there would also be a danger, and I nearly fell into it myself, of just assuming that privacy, the way we view it in the Western world and the way we live in a very independent and fairly, self-centric way, let's face it. I wonder if that needs to be explored to make sure that we've actually, included all attitudes to privacy in all cultures.
Wow, that's a blockbuster answer. I like that. It's so true.
Come back to me in that one. You can work that one out.
Very good. Very good. Well, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure to do this with you.
It's been a joy chatting to you.
Yeah, this is great. And we'll continue our other collaborations together.
We will.
But I think this is great. I think people need to know a lot more about identity, and what you're doing about telling the story is vital for the future.
Yeah, so. Absolutely.
Well,
thanks, Debbie. You look after yourself, and have a great break when you get to the holiday season.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Take care. Thanks again.